I keep replaying the moment in my head because it feels impossible that something so small could destroy an entire life. Not a huge fight. Not violence. Not some dramatic screaming match in the rain like in movies. Just one sentence. 3 words, actually. It's too small. That was it. If someone had told me a year ago that those words would eventually lead to divorce papers sitting on my kitchen counter at 2 a.m. while my husband slept in the guest room, I would have laughed in their face. But here we are. I'm 31F. My husband, Ethan, is 34M. We'd been together almost 9 years. Married for 6. From the outside, we looked painfully stable. We had routines. Shared bills. Matching towels because Ethan thought random colors looked chaotic. Sunday grocery shopping. Friday takeout nights. The same side of the bed every night. People envied us. That's the funny part. Nobody notices when a relationship dies slowly. There's no funeral for it. No official date. It just starts shrinking. Little by little. And you barely notice until one day you can't breathe inside it anymore. Looking back, I think the first crack happened last winter. I'd bought this ceramic coffee mug from a tiny street market downtown. Dark blue with little hand-painted stars all over it. Completely unnecessary purchase, but I loved it immediately. The next morning, Ethan looked at it while scrolling on his phone. Then he said, "Why'd you buy that one?" I shrugged. I liked it. He took the mug from my hand, squinted at it for a second, and laughed softly. "It's too small." That should have been meaningless. Normal people would forget that conversation in 30 seconds. But for some reason, I didn't. Maybe because of the tone. Maybe because Ethan always sounded slightly disappointed when I liked something too much. Not angry. Not cruel. Just dismissive. Like every little joy I had needed to be corrected into something more practical. I remember joking back, "Not everything has to be oversized and efficient, Ethan." He smirked without looking up from his phone. "Some things do." Again, tiny moment. Completely forgettable. Except after that, I started noticing how often he did it. My haircut was a bit much. My music was kind of noisy. The candles I bought smelled too sweet. The movie I cried during was predictable. Every comment sounded harmless alone. Together, they started feeling like sandpaper against my brain. I don't even think he realized he was doing it. That somehow made it worse. Around that time, I started staying out later after work. Nothing suspicious at first. Just walking around stores, sitting in cafes longer than necessary, delaying going home. One night I ended up joining a gym 2 blocks from my office. That's where I met Daniel. And before anyone immediately jumps to conclusions, no, nothing happened right away. Honestly, I didn't even like him at first. He was the exact opposite of Ethan. Loud. Confident. Annoyingly observant. The type of person who acted familiar with everyone within 5 minutes. The first thing he ever said to me was, "You always look like you're thinking about escaping." I laughed awkwardly because, who says that to strangers? But he wasn't wrong. A few weeks later, after one of the evening classes, the power briefly went out in part of the gym. One overhead light kept flickering above us while everyone else left. Daniel looked up at it and shook his head. "That thing's too small for this whole room." My stomach immediately tightened. Same sentence. Different meaning. And somehow, for the first time in months, I couldn't stop smiling on the drive home. I told myself it was harmless. That's probably the most dangerous lie people tell themselves before everything goes wrong. Harmless. Daniel became part of my routine faster than I expected. Mostly because he made ordinary conversations feel awake. Ethan and I used to talk for hours when we first dated. About movies, weird conspiracy theories, places we wanted to travel, dumb hypothetical questions at 1 a.m. At some point, those conversations turned into, "Did you pay the internet bill? What do you want for dinner? Your mom called." That was it. But Daniel noticed things. Remembered details. Asked follow-up questions. One evening after class, I mentioned wanting to learn photography someday. The next day he asked, "So what kind of camera would you buy first?" It shocked me that he remembered. Which sounds pathetic now that I write it out. I started staying at the gym longer than necessary. Stretching after workouts I'd already finished. Sitting near the front desk pretending to check emails while Daniel cleaned equipment or talked to members. Nothing inappropriate happened. At least not physically. But emotionally, I think I already knew I was crossing lines. Because I stopped mentioning him to Ethan. That's usually the first real sign, isn't it? Not touching. Not flirting. Hiding. One Friday night Ethan and I went to dinner with another married couple we'd known for years. Halfway through the meal, the other wife jokingly asked, "So when are you two finally having kids?" I froze. Ethan answered automatically, "We'll see." That was his answer to everything lately. We'll see. Maybe. Eventually. Later. Like our whole future was permanently buffering. On the drive home I asked him directly, "Do you even want kids anymore?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Why are we doing this conversation again?" "Because you avoid it every time." "I'm not avoiding it. You literally just did." He sighed heavily, like I was exhausting him. "I just think our apartment's too small right now." There it was again. Too small. Something about hearing those words one more time made irritation crawl under my skin instantly. I looked out the passenger window and muttered, "Maybe you just make everything feel small." He glanced at me sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" I almost answered honestly. That being around him lately felt like slowly disappearing. That every dream, every emotion, every spontaneous part of me got flattened into something practical and manageable. But instead I just said, "Nothing." The rest of the drive home was silent. That night Ethan reached for me in bed. Not passionately. Not emotionally. Just routine. Like checking a box before sleep. I let him kiss my neck for maybe 10 seconds before I quietly said I was tired. He rolled over immediately without arguing. And somehow that hurt more than if he'd gotten angry. The next Monday, Daniel noticed bruising near my wrist from deadlifts. He lightly touched my arm while looking at it. "You push yourself harder than you admit." It was such a small moment. But my entire body reacted. Not because of the touch itself. Because of the attention. I pulled my arm back too quickly and laughed nervously. "I'm fine." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "You don't seem fine." Nobody had asked me that in a very long time. I should have created distance right then. Instead, I stayed after closing again. We sat near the empty stretching area talking while rain hit the front windows. Mostly stupid topics. Childhood stories. Bad jobs. Relationships. When he asked about my marriage, I automatically said, "It's good." But the pause before answering lasted too long. Daniel noticed. Of course he did. He leaned back against the wall and studied me for a second before speaking. "You know what your problem is?" I laughed quietly. "This should be interesting. You keep trying to fit yourself into spaces that stopped fitting you years ago." My chest tightened immediately. Because somehow he kept saying things I already felt but had never spoken out loud. Then he smiled slightly and added, "And honestly, I think you've been lonely for a long time." That sentence followed me home like a shadow. And for the first time in my marriage, I didn't want Ethan touching me at all. For the next couple of weeks, I avoided being alone with Daniel. Not because I suddenly developed morals. Because I knew exactly what was happening. People love pretending affairs begin with one dramatic moment. A kiss in the rain. A drunken mistake. Some cinematic loss of control. That's not how it starts. It starts quietly. You begin looking forward to someone noticing you. Then you start dressing slightly differently on days you know you'll see them. Then you catch yourself rehearsing conversations in your head. Then one day you realize you're emotionally somewhere you absolutely shouldn't be. And by then, you're already in trouble. I started taking earlier classes at the gym. Different machines. Shorter workouts. Daniel noticed immediately. "Did I scare you off or something?" He said it jokingly, but I could tell he genuinely wanted an answer. I laughed awkwardly. No. Just busy. He looked unconvinced but didn't push. That should have been the end of it. Instead, things at home got worse. Not explosive worse. Quiet worse. Which is somehow more depressing. Ethan and I moved around each other like co-workers forced to share office space. We still functioned normally, laundry, dishes, grocery shopping, but emotionally it felt empty. One night I tried fixing it. Actually tried. I made dinner. Lit candles. Put on music Ethan used to like back when we were dating. When he got home, he looked genuinely confused. What's all this? I just wanted us to have an actual night together. He smiled politely, loosened his tie, and sat down. For the first 15 minutes, it almost worked. We laughed a little. Talked normally. Then I mentioned maybe taking a trip somewhere together. Even just a weekend. Ethan immediately started listing reasons it wasn't practical. Flights are expensive right now. My schedule's packed. Maybe later in the year. I stared at him across the table and suddenly realized something horrifying. He approached happiness like a budgeting problem. Every exciting thing had to survive a cost-benefit analysis before he allowed himself to enjoy it. I don't think he even knew he was doing it. Then came the moment I still hate myself for. I showed him some photos I'd taken on my phone during lunch breaks downtown. Random street photography stuff. Reflections, buildings, strangers in cafes. I was actually proud of them. Ethan looked through them silently for a few seconds before handing my phone back. They're good. But he said it the same way someone compliments a child's drawing. Then he added, "You probably need a better lens though. These feel limited. Limited. Too small. Not enough." Everything suddenly felt connected. I snapped. "Do you ever hear yourself?" Ethan blinked. "What? You criticize everything I care about." "That's not true." "It is. You always find some tiny flaw in everything." He leaned back, clearly irritated now. "You're overreacting." That phrase almost made me laugh. Overreacting. The official slogan of emotionally unavailable husbands everywhere. I stood up from the table so fast my chair scraped loudly across the floor. "You know what the worst part is?" I said. "You don't even realize how exhausting you are." Ethan stared at me like I'd become a different person. Where is this even coming from? And there it was. That question people ask when they ignored problems for so long they genuinely think they appeared overnight. I almost told him about Daniel right then. Not the attraction. Just the conversations. The feeling of being seen again. But I didn't. Because some selfish part of me wanted to keep it. The next evening, after work, I went back to the gym late. I told myself it was for closure. Distance. Proof that I could handle this like an adult. Instead, I found Daniel alone near the front desk eating protein bars for dinner. He looked up and grinned immediately. There she is. That stupid sentence made my heart beat noticeably faster. I hated that. We talked for nearly an hour after closing. Nothing physical happened. But emotionally, I crossed a line that night. Because at one point Daniel looked directly at me and quietly asked, "Are you actually happy?" And instead of lying, I started crying. I cried for maybe 30 seconds before I got embarrassed and tried laughing it off. Which somehow made it worse. Daniel immediately handed me a towel from the counter because apparently the gym had no tissues anywhere. "Wow," I muttered, wiping my face. "This is humiliating." "No," he said calmly. "Humiliating is pretending you're okay for years." That hit harder than it should have. I sat down on one of the benches near the mirrors and tried pulling myself together while the gym lights dimmed into nighttime mode around us. The whole place felt strangely intimate when empty. Quiet music playing overhead. Rain against the windows. Just the two of us sitting there after everyone else had gone home. Dangerous setting. Dangerous mood. Dangerous person. I knew all of that. And I still stayed. Daniel sat beside me, elbows resting on his knees. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said. "But you look exhausted." I stared down at the floor tiles for a long moment before answering. I think I disappeared somewhere along the way. The second I said it out loud, my chest tightened. Because it was true. Marriage hadn't destroyed me overnight. It had slowly edited parts of me out until only the functional pieces remained. Responsible wife. Reliable adult. Predictable partner. Everything clean and manageable. Nothing messy. Nothing loud. Nothing selfish. Daniel watched me carefully. And does your husband know you feel like this? I gave a quiet laugh. I don't even think he'd understand the question. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Then Daniel leaned back slightly and asked, "So why stay?" And there it was. The question I'd been avoiding for months. Why stay? Because Ethan wasn't abusive. Because he was loyal. Because stable relationships aren't supposed to be abandoned just because you feel emotionally restless. Because adults are supposed to appreciate consistency. Because leaving a decent man makes you look like the villain. I finally shrugged weakly. I don't know anymore. Daniel nodded slowly like he already expected that answer. Then he said something that changed everything. You know what scares people the most? What? Realizing they built an entire life around being tolerated instead of being loved. I felt that sentence physically. Like impact. The worst part? A small piece of me immediately wanted him to kiss me after saying it. That terrified me. I stood up too quickly. I should go home. Daniel stood too, but kept a respectful distance. Okay. No pressure. No dramatic move. Honestly, if he'd tried something right there, I probably would have left and never come back. But restraint is sometimes more seductive than aggression. As I grabbed my bag, Daniel quietly added, "For what it's worth. I don't think you're hard to love." I couldn't even look at him after that. I drove home with my hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel. And when I walked into the apartment, Ethan was asleep on the couch with the TV still on. Blanket folded neatly over him. Glasses slightly crooked. One hand resting on his chest. For a second, guilt hit me so hard I almost felt sick. Because despite everything, he trusted me completely. I remember standing there in the dark realizing I was emotionally cheating already. Maybe worse. Because physical mistakes can happen fast. This had been growing slowly and intentionally. Ethan woke up slightly when I walked past. "What time is it?" he mumbled. "Late. You were at the gym?" "Yeah." He nodded sleepily. "Okay." That was it. No curiosity. No concern. No "how was your night?" Just automatic acceptance. And somehow that hurt too. The next morning, I tried convincing myself to cut contact with Daniel completely. Delete the gym membership. Reset my brain. Focus on my marriage. Adult solution. Responsible solution. Then around noon, my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. "Hope you're feeling better today." That should have been innocent. Simple. Normal. Instead, I stared at the screen for almost 5 straight minutes before replying. And the moment I answered, I think I already knew how this story would end. At first, the messages stayed harmless. That's another lie people tell themselves. Harmless never stays harmless for long when two people are already emotionally leaning toward each other. Daniel texted me stupid things throughout the day. Gym memes. Complaints about clients who never re-racked weights. Random observations about strangers. Normal conversation. But my mood started depending on it in a way that should have alarmed me. I'd catch myself checking my phone during work meetings. Smiling at notifications. Getting disappointed when hours passed without hearing from him. Meanwhile, Ethan and I barely talked unless it involved logistics. One night we ate dinner across from each other in complete silence except for the TV in the background. I finally muted it. "We need to talk." Ethan immediately sighed like a man preparing for bad customer service. That reaction alone irritated me. "I feel like we're becoming strangers," I said carefully. "We're not strangers." "Then what are we?" "We're married." That answer genuinely stunned me. Not because it was wrong. Because it sounded so empty. Like marriage itself was supposed to be the solution instead of the relationship inside it. I stared at him for a second before asking, "Do you even still want me?" He looked confused. What kind of question is that? A real one. Of course I do. But why? Now he looked annoyed. What does that even mean? I couldn't explain it properly without sounding insane. I wanted passion. Attention. Curiosity. I wanted someone to look at me like there was still something left to discover. Instead, Ethan looked at me like furniture he'd owned for years. Useful. Reliable. Expected. He rubbed his forehead tiredly. "You've been acting different lately." There was something in his voice I hadn't heard before. Concern. Real concern. And for one terrifying moment, I almost told him everything. Not the cheating. Not yet. But enough to save us maybe. Instead, my phone buzzed on the table. Daniel. Ethan glanced at the screen automatically. Just one notification preview. Don't let your brain bully you tonight. Ethan looked back at me slowly. Who's Daniel? My entire body tightened instantly. Coworker. Trainer. Friend. I had 10 possible answers ready. But the hesitation before speaking gave me away immediately. Someone from the gym. Ethan's expression changed very slightly. Not dramatic. Just alert. Why is he texting you like that? Because we're friends. The second I said it, I knew how weak it sounded. Ethan leaned back in his chair quietly. How close are you two? I should have lied better. Instead I said, nothing's happened. And technically, at that moment, it was true. But Ethan noticed what I didn't say. His jaw tightened slightly. That's not what I asked. Silence filled the kitchen. Heavy silence. Finally he stood up and grabbed his plate. I'm going to bed. That's it. What do you want me to do? He asked calmly. Scream? Throw something? Honestly, part of me did. Anything emotional would have felt better than this cold restraint. Instead he carried his plate to the sink and quietly added, "If you're unhappy, just tell me before you do something stupid." That sentence stayed in my head the entire night. Because deep down, I think he already knew. The next evening I went to the gym anyway. Which probably says everything about me as a person. Daniel noticed immediately that something was wrong. You okay? I laughed nervously. My husband saw your texts. His face changed instantly. Oh, yeah. You want me to back off? The responsible answer was yes. The correct answer was absolutely yes. Instead I asked, would you? Daniel looked at me for a long moment before answering. No. That should have scared me. Instead, heat rushed through my chest so fast it almost felt embarrassing. The gym was mostly empty that night. Just music humming softly overhead and a couple people near the cardio section. Daniel stepped a little closer. Not touching me. Just close enough that I became hyper-aware of everything. You know this is dangerous now, right? He said quietly. I nodded. And you still came. Another nod. His eyes dropped briefly to my lips before returning to my face. Why? I wish I could say I answered thoughtfully. Something intelligent. Something mature. But the truth came out before I could stop it. Because when I'm with you, I whispered, I don't feel invisible. And that was the moment everything crossed the point of return. Daniel kissed me 3 nights later. Not at the gym. Not dramatically. Not even planned. Which somehow made it worse. Ethan had gone out of town for a 2-day work conference, and I spent the first evening alone in the apartment trying to convince myself I still had control over the situation. I cleaned obsessively. Laundry. Counters. Bathroom mirrors. Anything to avoid thinking. Around 9 p.m., Daniel texted. You okay? I should have ignored it. Instead, I answered immediately. That turned into a phone call. The phone call turned into laughing. The laughing turned into an hour disappearing without me noticing. Then he said, you sound less tense tonight. I leaned back against the couch cushions and closed my eyes. Maybe because nobody's criticizing how I fold towels right now. Daniel laughed softly. He actually does that. You have no idea. A pause. Then. You wanna get out of the apartment for a bit? I already knew I was going to say yes before he finished asking. We ended up walking downtown near the river because almost everything else was closed. Cold air. Empty sidewalks. Quiet city lights reflecting off the water. It felt strangely peaceful. Easy. That was the dangerous part with Daniel. Nothing ever felt forced. At one point we stopped near a food stand still open late at night. I ordered coffee, and the guy accidentally handed it to me in one of those ridiculously tiny paper cups. Daniel looked at it and smirked. That thing's way too small. I burst out laughing immediately. Real laughing. The kind where your stomach hurts a little. And suddenly Daniel was staring at me differently. Not just amused. Focused. Like he'd forgotten everything around us for a second. What? I asked. You laugh with your whole face. That tiny sentence hit harder than flirting probably should have. We kept walking after that, but something had shifted. The space between us felt charged now. Intentional. When we finally got back to my apartment building, I should have said goodnight outside. Instead I heard myself say, "You can come up for one drink if you want." Even typing that now makes me feel sick. Because people always know. Maybe not consciously. But somewhere deep down, they know exactly what invitation they're really giving. Daniel hesitated before answering. You sure? No. I wasn't. But I nodded anyway. Inside the apartment, everything suddenly felt too quiet. Too intimate. I noticed dumb details immediately: Ethan's jacket hanging near the door, our framed wedding photo on the shelf, his coffee mug still near the sink. Guilt started crawling up my spine almost instantly. I poured drinks mostly to avoid eye contact. Daniel stayed respectful. Careful. He didn't move closer. Didn't touch me. Honestly, if he had been aggressive about it, I think reality would have hit me harder. Instead we just talked on the couch. Normal conversation. Until it wasn't. At some point there was silence between us. Not awkward silence. The dangerous kind. The kind where both people are thinking the exact same thing and pretending they aren't. Daniel looked at me carefully. We should probably stop this before something happens. I knew he was right. I also knew neither of us was leaving. I know, I whispered. But neither of us moved. Then he said the sentence that completely broke whatever self-control I had left. You deserve to feel wanted. I don't even remember who kissed who first. I just remember suddenly being close enough to feel his heartbeat through his shirt. Then his hand against my waist. Then the terrifying realization that I wasn't pulling away. The kiss itself wasn't explosive or movie perfect. It was worse. It felt emotional. Like months of loneliness collapsing all at once. That's the part one still can't fully explain. It wasn't even really about desire anymore. It was relief. Relief that somebody looked at me like I mattered again. When we finally pulled apart, reality hit me so hard I stood up immediately. Oh my God. Daniel stood too. Hey. I can't do this. You already know you want to. That sentence should have offended me. Instead, the worst part was that he was right. And when he stepped closer again, I didn't stop him the second time. I barely slept after Daniel left. Not because we'd done anything extreme. Because reality finally caught up to me. I spent almost the entire night sitting on the edge of the bed staring at the dark apartment while my brain replayed everything over and over again. The kiss. His voice. The way I'd immediately wanted more even while knowing I should stop. That was the part that scared me most. Not losing control. Wanting to lose it again. Around 3 a.m., I walked into the kitchen for water and noticed Ethan's mug near the sink. The plain grey one he'd used every morning for years. Simple. Practical. Boring. I suddenly hated it irrationally. Not because of the mug itself. Because it represented him perfectly. Safe. Predictable. Emotionally impossible to drown in. And after meeting Daniel, part of me realized I'd secretly been starving for intensity. The next morning Ethan texted me from the conference. Miss you. 3 hours later. How's your day going? I stared at the messages feeling like the worst human being alive. Because now that I'd crossed the line physically, His kindness felt unbearable. I answered normally anyway. That's another horrifying thing about cheating. You become disturbingly good at acting normal. That evening Daniel texted me. I shouldn't say this, but I can't stop thinking about you. I read it at least 10 times. Then deleted the conversation. Then restored it again 5 minutes later because apparently I had completely lost my mind. For the next week, things escalated fast. Too fast. We started finding excuses to meet outside the gym. Coffee after work. Walks downtown. Sitting in his car talking for hours because neither of us wanted the night to end. And every time I told myself, this is the last time. It never was. The intimacy became harder to ignore too. Small touches started lingering longer. His hand against my lower back guiding me through crowds. My knees touching his in restaurants without either of us moving away. One night we ended up back at his apartment after a late dinner. I knew exactly what was about to happen the second he unlocked the door. And still, I walked inside. The guilt was unbelievable. But so was the feeling of being wanted. Daniel kissed me the second the apartment door closed behind us. More urgently this time. Months of tension finally collapsing completely. I remember grabbing his shirt and immediately hating myself for how natural it felt. We stumbled into the living room laughing nervously at first, but underneath it was something much more dangerous. Need. Real need. The kind you can't rationalize away anymore. At one point he pulled back slightly and looked at me carefully. Tell me to stop. I should have. Instead I kissed him again. Afterward, I sat at the edge of his bed trying to steady my breathing while shame slowly flooded back into my chest. Daniel sat beside me quietly for a minute before asking, "Regret it?" I answered too honestly, "Yes. But not enough." He looked at me for a long time after that. Not proudly. Not smugly. Almost sadly. Like he understood exactly how messy this had become. Then his expression changed slightly. "You know this can't stay hidden forever." I nodded silently. Because deep down, I think I already felt my marriage collapsing in real time. The worst part? When I got home that night, Ethan had returned early from his trip. He was asleep in our bed. One arm stretched across my side like he'd unconsciously reached for me while sleeping. And I stood there in the dark, still smelling like someone else, realizing I had officially become the kind of person I used to judge. For the next few days, I became obsessed with acting normal. Which is ironic, because I'd never felt less normal in my life. I overcompensated constantly around Ethan. Asked about his day more. Sat closer to him on the couch. Forced casual affection so he wouldn't notice the growing distance underneath it all. And somehow that felt almost worse than the cheating itself. Because now I was performing marriage instead of living it. Ethan noticed something was off anyway. People always do eventually. One night we were getting ready for bed when he suddenly asked, "Are you still talking to him?" My stomach dropped instantly even though he didn't say Daniel's name. I kept brushing my teeth to avoid eye contact. Sometimes. Ethan leaned against the bathroom doorway watching me quietly. "You know what's weird?" I rinsed my mouth slowly. "What?" "You smile at your phone more than you smile at me lately." That sentence hit harder than yelling would've. Because it was true. I tried defending myself anyway. "We're just friends." The second those words left my mouth, even I hated how fake they sounded. Ethan laughed once under his breath. Not amused. Just tired. "I'm not stupid." Silence filled the bathroom. Heavy silence. Then he asked the question I'd been dreading for weeks. "Did something happen between you two?" I should have confessed right there. Maybe everything after that could have been different. Instead I said, "No." And that lie permanently changed something in me. Because once you look directly at someone who trusts you and lie to their face that calmly, you realize how far you've already fallen. Ethan stared at me for a long moment like he was searching for something in my expression. Finally he nodded slowly. "Okay." That was it. No fight. No accusation. Just okay. And somehow that hurt more than if he'd screamed. The next day Daniel noticed immediately that something was wrong. "You look pale." My husband asked if we slept together. Daniel's expression tightened. What did you say? I lied. He looked away for a second before quietly muttering. Yeah, this is getting bad. That should have been the moment we ended it. Instead, later that night, I was back at his apartment. Affairs destroy your sense of logic. You start thinking emotionally instead of structurally. You focus on moments instead of consequences. And with Daniel, every moment felt intense. Addictive. That night we sat on his balcony drinking cheap wine while the city lights flickered below us. At one point he looked over at me and asked, "Do you love him?" The question caught me off guard. Because despite everything, I did. Or at least, I loved the version of us we used to be. I don't know anymore, I admitted. Daniel nodded slowly like he expected that answer. Then he asked something worse. Do you think he actually sees you? I opened my mouth immediately to defend Ethan. But nothing came out. Because I wasn't sure anymore. Daniel moved closer beside me, resting his hand lightly over mine. People deserve more than survival mode relationships. His voice was soft, careful, dangerously convincing. I leaned into him before I could stop myself. And suddenly we were kissing again. Longer this time. More emotionally reckless. I remember him pulling back slightly and smiling against my forehead. You have no idea how hard it was not touching you all those weeks. That sentence sent warmth through my chest so fast it almost made me dizzy. Nobody had wanted me like that in years. Not visibly. Not openly. Not intensely. And once you experience that kind of attention after feeling emotionally invisible for so long, it becomes terrifyingly hard to give up. But while Daniel held me that night, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from Ethan. Did you leave your old blue mug at work? I can't find it. I froze instantly. Because suddenly I remembered the stupid little mug that started all of this. And for the first time, I had the horrifying realization that maybe it was never about the mug at all. Maybe the real problem was that I'd spent months waiting for Ethan to notice I was breaking apart. While another man already had. After Ethan texted me about the mug, I couldn't focus on anything Daniel was saying anymore. It felt stupid. Ridiculous even. Out of everything happening, the lying, the cheating, the collapse of my marriage, my brain suddenly fixated on a ceramic cup with painted stars on it. Maybe because it represented a version of me I barely recognized now. Before all this, I used to care about tiny things. Random joy. Small excitement. Personality. Now I was sneaking around like a stranger inside my own life. Daniel noticed my expression immediately. You okay? I nodded too fast. Yeah. Just tired. But the mood had shifted. At least for me. I left his apartment earlier than usual that night, and during the drive home guilt sat so heavily in my chest it almost felt physical. When I walked into the apartment, Ethan was still awake. Sitting at the kitchen counter. The blue mug in front of him. My stomach dropped. I found it, he said quietly. I stared at him. What? The mug. He rotated it slightly in his hands. It was in the back of the cabinet. Something about the way he looked at me felt different. Too calm. Too observant. I suddenly became hyper-aware of everything, the late hour, my nervous breathing, the fact I'd changed clothes at Daniel's apartment but still smelled faintly like his cologne. Ethan studied me for a few seconds before speaking again. You've been gone a lot lately. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to lie again. Gym. Work. Friends. Anything. Instead I just whispered. I know. He looked down at the mug. You remember when I said this was too small? I nodded carefully. Ethan gave a humorless little laugh. You got really upset over that. It wasn't about the mug. I know that now. That sentence hit me immediately. Because suddenly I realized something terrifying. Ethan had been paying attention more than I thought. Just too late. He ran his thumb slowly along the rim of the cup. I think I got comfortable, he admitted quietly. I thought being stable was enough. I felt tears building instantly. Because this was the emotional honesty I'd wanted from him for months. And now it was happening after I'd already betrayed him. Too late. Always too late. Ethan finally looked directly at me. Did you sleep with him? There it was. No avoiding it anymore. No softened version. Just truth sitting between us. I opened my mouth. Closed it again. And Ethan's expression changed before I even answered. Because silence is an answer too. He stood up slowly from the counter. Not angry. That somehow made it worse. Just devastated. I started crying immediately. Ethan. How long? A few weeks. He nodded once like each word physically hurt him. Then he asked the question that completely shattered me. Was I really that bad? The guilt that hit me in that moment is impossible to describe properly. Because despite everything wrong between us, he didn't deserve this. No, I said instantly. No, you weren't bad. Then why? I wish I had a cleaner answer. Something dramatic. Something understandable. But the truth sounded pathetic out loud. Because he made me feel seen. Ethan looked at me like I'd stabbed him. And honestly, maybe I had. The silence after that felt endless. Finally Ethan laughed quietly to himself, but there was no humor in it. All this, he muttered, glancing down at the mug again. Over tiny little things. I wiped tears from my face shakily. It wasn't tiny to me. No, he said softly. I guess it wasn't. Then came the sentence I still hear in my head sometimes at night. Ethan looked around our apartment, the photos, the furniture, the life we built together, and quietly said, I didn't realize our marriage was becoming too small for you. After that conversation, nothing exploded the way movies pretend it does. No screaming. No smashed plates. No dramatic storming out. Just silence. The kind that settles into walls permanently. Ethan slept in the guest room that night. I stayed awake in our bedroom listening to every tiny sound in the apartment, footsteps, doors, the hum of the refrigerator, realizing this was probably the last time our home would ever feel like ours. The next morning, I found him sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee from the blue mug. My mug. For some reason, that detail hurt more than anything else. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. Like one night had taken years off him. I called a lawyer, he said quietly. Straight to the point. No cruelty. No revenge. Just fact. I sat down slowly across from him, feeling numb. Okay. That seemed to surprise him a little. Maybe he expected begging. Denial. Excuses. But deep down, I think we both understood something important now. Our marriage had started breaking long before Daniel entered the picture. He was just the person who exposed the cracks. Ethan rubbed tiredly at his eyes. I keep replaying everything trying to figure out when I lost you. That sentence nearly broke me again. Because the horrible truth was, I didn't think there was one specific moment. It happened gradually. Ignored conversations. Dismissed feelings. Routine replacing intimacy. Two people becoming emotionally smaller around each other year after year until eventually there wasn't enough room left to breathe. And then someone else came along and noticed me before my own husband did. That's what destroyed us. Not one kiss. Not one night. 1,000 tiny things. A week later, I ended things with Daniel. People probably expect some huge romantic choice there. Like I realized he was my soulmate and we rode off into the sunset together. That's not real life. The affair had burned hot because it existed in stolen moments and emotional fantasy. Once my marriage collapsed for real, reality started touching everything. Daniel looked genuinely shocked when I told him. I thought you wanted this. I thought I did too. You love him. I hurt him, I answered quietly. That's not the same thing. Daniel ran a frustrated hand through his hair. So what now? I didn't have an answer. Because once the excitement disappeared, all that remained was damage. A few days later, Ethan came by while I was packing some of my things. The apartment felt unfamiliar already. Colder. Smaller. Funny enough. He noticed the mug sitting wrapped in newspaper inside a box. You taking that? I looked down at it for a second. Then I shook my head. No. You keep it. Ethan stared at me like he wanted to say something more. And for a second, I almost wished he would yell. Hate me. Call me selfish. Instead he just asked. Did he really make you happier? That question still haunts me. Because the truthful answer is complicated. For a while. Yes. Daniel made me feel alive again. Wanted. Important. But excitement and fulfillment are not the same thing. Affairs are built inside artificial conditions. Secrets. Escapism. Fantasy versions of people. Real relationships survive ordinary life. And ours stopped surviving long before either of us admitted it. Before leaving, Ethan picked up the blue mug one last time and quietly said, "You know what's funny?" I looked at him. It was never too small. He gave a sad little smile. We just stopped filling it with anything worth keeping. That was 6 months ago. We're divorced now. I still think about him sometimes when I see tiny ceramic mugs in store windows. And honestly, the worst part isn't that I cheated. The worst part is realizing how many relationships die slowly from neglect while both people convince themselves everything is fine. Until one day, someone notices the emptiness before your partner does. And by then, it's already too late.